yourself a monster, giant, beast, Goliath, a rock, any king with this rock in my sling up. I've been hunting all day, boy. I've been hunting all day.
Love that intro. Hello, my name is Robbie. On here, I'm Templar Knight. Every person who believes in God but does not attend a church has a story why. But it's said that whenever two or more people gather in God's name, that He is there. So this is church. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, again, we are continuing the story of David the Great. Tonight's story is, this chapter in his life, the life of David, is not as well known and not as well talked about. When I was looking through references to find out about this time period, it's in the Bible, but the extra sources, not so much, because tonight we get to see David in the time that he lived, not in the Christian ideals that we want to think someone like King David the Great lived in. So, yeah, tonight we get to hear a little more of the dark side of David's story. Now, last week, where did we leave off? Ah, yes. Saul had once again come to try and kill David. David had the opportunity to kill him and did not. Saul, realizing how foolish he had been, apologized and left. But David's done playing these games. He's done with the hide and seek. So where does he go? He goes to Gath. Again, why would you go to Gath? You killed their champion. Your nation is at war with theirs. But this time David has a plan. Because although Saul wants him dead, and the Philistines would probably prefer him dead, David can use this to his advantage. So he rolls up with the Gibberine, David's mighty men, his 600 elite fighters. And he makes a deal with King Achish. Now, mind you, last time David was in Gath, he kind of had to fake being a mad person to escape, because he got arrested and was in prison, and faked mental insanity so that they would chase him away, because back in those days, a lot of pagan tribes were not okay with mental illness and would worry about it being contagious and just need it gone. So the deal that David and King Achish strike up is that David will go and raid Israelites' towns and villages and split the plunder with Achish. In exchange, Achish will give David a place to be, a place to call home, no longer a nomadic roaming tribe going through the deserts, through the wastelands, just struggling to survive. He'll give them a home. But if David won't kill King Saul, what makes you guys think he would ever kill Israelites? Those are his people. They are Israelites. Now Achish does this because he's got a plan himself. Achish knows that if he can get David to fight against Israel, then Israel will not take him back. And if you've been following these wars, ever since David killed Goliath, Philistine hadn't been doing so good. The Israelites have been getting some serious dominance due to David and his God-given ability to guide, to lead battle, his blessing. David's a monster on the battlefield. So that's Achish's plan. Get David to turn on Israel so that the Israelites will never take him back. Well, David has a plan too. he tells Achish he's going to go off and raid Israel. And so him and the Gibbering turn and they march off. Now the Gibbering are a little confused by this because we're about to go raid our people. And David's like, nah, I got a plan. So once they are well out of sight, marching towards Israel, they turn. And they head south to where the Amalekites are. Why? Because the enemy of my allies is my enemy. See, Israel is also at war with the Amalekites. The Amalekites are often raiding Israel, and I'm sure Israel's doing the same. But this is David's plan. He's going to go and raid Amalekite villages, Amalekite towns. And he's going to return with the loot and say that he got in Israel. I mean, sounds like a brilliant plan. Except there is one slight flaw in this. But David knows it. And the flaw is that if word gets back to King Achish that David is actually going after the Amalekites and not the Israelites, Achish is going to be big mad. So David has a plan for this. No witnesses. When David and the Gibbering roll into these Amalekite villages, no one makes it out alive. Not the soldiers, not the farmers, not the men, not the women, not the children. Now for us, that's going a little hard there, Dave. But this was what he had to do. If any word had gotten out of what he was doing, Achish and Philistines would have turned on him. Now for us, that's hard, man. Good guys don't kill kids. Well, this was the Bronze Age. And David wasn't such a good guy yet. He was a mercenary hired to do a job, and he did what he had to do. Now, David is the best raider that the Philistines had ever had. His war bands were top-notch. Especially since he wasn't leaving anything behind. So Philistines' profits grew while David was out making raids. So David was rewarded with the town of Ziklag. It was a town in the southeast corner of Philistine. It's just east of Israel, or it has Israel just to the east, which is why King Achish put him there. Easy access. But it also had real easy access to the Amalekites. Here, let me show you this real quick. So this here. In purple, we have the nation of Israel. In yellow, we have the Philistines. Down here in green is the Amalekites. Can y'all see that little dot there? The one that says Ziklag? That's where David lives. That is where King David, or sorry, not king yet. Well, yeah, the king of Ziklag, King David, finally a king of something. That's where he sits. That's where his raiders come from. If we look a little further up, right towards the purple border there, we see Gath. We see the village of Keilah that David was called to help. But look how close Ziklag is. How easy must it have been for David to raid the Amalekites and then return to Gath with his plunder? King Ahimelech would never know. So now that David and the Gibbering have Ziklag, they have a home. Their families can settle in. They can plant crops. They can raise animals. And then they can go out and raid on the weekends. Well, probably longer than that, but you get the point. They finally had a sense of security. Israel won't come for them because he's in Philistine. The Philistines love him because he's bringing in more loot than ever. The Israelites themselves, the farmers, the ranchers, the city folk, they love David because he's dealing with the Amalekite raiders. The only people who really got a problem with David's current setup is the Amalekites themselves, because them, not so much. They kind of got some beef with David. And the one problem with no longer being a roaming warband is that people know how to find you. Your enemies know where you lay your head. So one night, David is out raiding. The Gibberin are gone. They are doing what they do. And the Amalekite raiders show up at Ziklag. With David and the Gibberin gone, there was no one there to defend. So the Amalekites kidnapped their women. They took their children. They stole everything they could load into their wagons. Crops, animals, treasures, anything they could haul away. And then they burned and destroyed the rest, leaving Ziklag a smoldering ruin. When David returns, they are devastated. They are angry, they are hurt, they are confused. See, up until this point, the Gibberines had never known anything even close to defeat. This is their first sense of loss, and it wasn't even a fight that they lost. It was their lives. This was their home. This was safe. This was their security. And now it's all gone. So what do you do when you're mad and you're angry? You gotta blame someone. So the Gibberin blamed David. This was your fault. You took us away from our homes. You left our families vulnerable. And what does David do? David turns to God. He and his priest Ahimelech, they go to pray. Because even in this time of desperation, of anger, of loss, David knows how important it is to seek God's guidance. I can imagine David sitting there. God, they took my wives. They took all our wives, our children. Lord, they took everything we hold dear. Was this meant to be a lesson for me? Am I to learn from this? Or am I to go after them? Well, it did not take long for God to respond. David goes back to his men. He returns to them in their wailing, in their pain, in their suffering. Stands before them. Gibberin! Gibberin! Mount up These fools think they can destroy our homes? Steal our women? Take our children? You all act as though this is already over. But I tell you this, it has just begun. Crops can be regrown. Houses can be rebuilt. But first, let's go get back our families and teach a lesson for these fools to learn. Let's go show them what happens to anyone who dare cross the path of the Gibbery. Let's ride. And so the Gibberine get on their horses, grab their armor, grab their weapons, and they are off. Now mind you, the Gibberine is an elite tactics unit. These guys are the best. And now they are chasing a large convoy, moving their new slaves like herds of animals, their wagons slow and overburdened with all the loot. A child could have followed this caravan. For David and his men, these outlaw mercenaries, the pursuit was simple. It didn't take long for them to catch up, and when they did, they watched as they set up camp. And they waited for night to fall. And when the stars came out, so did all the terrors and nightmares that go bump in the night. See, David and his men, they're not what we would consider the good guys by our modern standards. They were mercenaries who would ride into town, crush any opposition, steal anything of value, and destroy everyone. Women, children, the old, the infirm, all would die. They didn't take slaves. They had to make sure no one knew what they were doing so that King Achish would never find out. And they've been doing this for a good almost 2 years now. Now, the type of mindset that it would take for a warrior to be able to do that, to be able to kill women and children and not have that weigh down on you, these were different times. It was their job to kill like this. But what do you think it was like for these men on that night? See, this was not just some thoughtless raid loot grab. They weren't just going to put in their work. They were striking back against the people who stole their families. The people who stole and destroyed everything that they owned. I'm guessing that for these professional killers, tonight was probably a little personal. So, I'm going to let your imagination draw pictures of what happened in this darkness. Or better yet, maybe don't. But just know that when the sun rose, the Amalekite raiding party was no more, except for a few lucky ones that were able to flee on camelback. The Ziklag women were rescued. The children were saved. The wagons, full of their food, full of their loot, were being turned back around. What a battle that must have been. I mean, I've been in some fights. I know the victory, the celebration, the anticipation of winning. I know how that can overwhelm you. But the petty squabbles I was in, nothing like this. The reunion of these men getting their wives back, getting to hold their children. I can just picture this scene. These mighty men, the Gibberine, losing everything, so enraged that they turn on their leader. Then the anticipation of the hunt, finding your prey, the rage of combat, and the sheer exultation of victory, followed by the joy of being reunited with those you love. It's too much for me. When I get excited, I respond with tears. And I wish I could have been there to see this through David's eyes. To see him leading the march of his men, going home, all the celebrations, seeing the people you fight beside celebrating with their loved ones and their children. David was a musician. He was a singer, he was a poet. And I see him walking up to the man beside him. I went to the enemy's camp, and I took back what was stolen from me. Going to the next man, embracing his wife. I went to the enemy's camp, and I took back what was stolen from me. Hopping up on a ledge so all of his men can see. I went to the enemy's camp, and I took back what was stolen from me. I went to the enemy's camp, and I took back what he stole from me. And they celebrated with him because they have a musical leader who loves to praise God in song. And they look around at all of them being embraced. The love, the joy. The Gibberine marched. The Gibberine praised God. They celebrated their victory as only men who served David could. And so they returned to Ziklag to rebuild, to live, to love, to grow, never to be crossed. I'm going to take a quick second here because I can feel that passion. And we are going to leave the gibbering in Ziklag for a minute, because our story takes us elsewhere. Over these years, while David has been raiding, Philistine has been prospering. And they decide it's time again to go to war with Israel. Because the last few times they've gone to war with Israel, they've been stopped. But, David doesn't fight for Israel anymore. So now here's David's dilemma. He gets word in Ziklag that, Philistine, the place he currently lives, is going to war. But thankfully, the Philistine leaders don't trust David enough. They fear that if they were to ask David and the Gibberine to come to war against Israel, they might turn sides. So, Philistine marches to war, and the Gibberine stay behind. Saul, knowing that the army is coming, gathers Israel's army. He will lead them. Saul was once a great leader. He was the first king. He brought together all the tribes of Israel. But he's no match for Philistine. Saul is gravely injured. His son, Prince Jonathan, was killed. And rather than be captured and tortured, when Saul realized that the war was lost, he chose to fall upon his own sword. And so ends the story of Saul. A mercenary for Israel saw the opportunity, realizing that the war was lost. He fled to Ziklag. He burst into the city crying out for David. Saul is dead. Where is David? Saul is dead. David comes to hear the tale. And this mercenary stands before him. I barely made it out of the Philistines' attack. Saul and Jonathan are dead. David drops to his knees in despair and asks to hear the whole story. Saul was his king. Jonathan was his best friend. More than a friend, more than a brother. And for some stupid reason, this mercenary decides he's going to lie a little bit in hopes to get in David's good graces. And he says, yeah, I was fighting, and when I realized we were going to lose, I saw Saul, and I went up to him, and I killed him. David comes back to the conversation. You killed my king? Is that what you are saying? And this mercenary must have missed it. I did. I killed him for you. I know how much he hated you and how he hunted you and all the horrible things he did and how he tried to have you killed. I killed him with this very sword. And he raises his sword and holds it up. Stone-faced, David just looks to his men. Make it slow. And without hesitation, before this Kingslayer can even protect himself with the sword he is showing off, a blade is thrust into his chest. The man goes down. David stands over him, grabs him by the hair. If I spared Saul's life all of these years, what makes you so stupid to think I would want you to kill him? Saul was my king. David throws him to the ground. The man dies, and David leaves to be alone in his grief. to mourn the loss of his best friend, to mourn the loss of his king. While David is spending time in mourning, Israel is falling apart without their king. All these tribes that Saul had brought together and united to become the nation of Israel, they're falling apart. The Hebrews, the tribe that David was from, was the first to break. And they sent for David because they knew all this time that David was to be the anointed king. Getting their summons, David leaves Ziklag and he goes back to Hebron. David and his men are finally welcomed back to Israel. Now, as you would expect, a lot of greedy people made their play for more power. You guys remember Abner? He was the guard that was with Saul when David could have killed them in their sleep. Well, Abner decides to crown Saul's youngest son, call him King Ishbosheth. But then Abner gets killed with all the political goings-on, and it really doesn't matter to the story. Well, turns out that King Ishbosheth is a really bad king. So, two captains that were loyal to Abner and upset about what happened, they form a plan, and they kill King Ishbosheth. They behead him, and they take the head to David. Hearing that these two had killed King Ishbosheth, David turns to his man, "Make it fast." And before these two kingslayers know what happened, the swords fall. David gets up and he walks away to pray. Apparently they did not understand that's still sin. You do not kill your king. So with no one on the throne, Israel is falling apart. The northern tribes finally relent and go to David. "We need you to be king. You have been the king since you were a boy. You were anointed. We just felt that we had to remain loyal to Saul. But you are God's chosen king, anointed. Lead us." So at the age of 37, over 20 years after the prophet Samuel had anointed him, David is finally the king over all of Israel.
You can call yourself a monster, giant,